Welcome to today's webinar, Alcohol and the Teenage Brain. I'm Richard Lewis, Coordinator of the School Community Relations Department for Orange County Schools in Hillsborough, North Carolina. I'll be moderating the webinar today. During this presentation, you'll learn about the newest research regarding adolescent binge drinking and the impact this has on teen brains. We'll address questions that the audience submitted at the end of the presentation. Now let's get started. Today I'm going to be giving you a brief tour of some of the amazing resources BrainFacts has for educators. We are going to begin today by looking at the For Educators page. To find this page, you will go to the top left corner of the BrainFacts.org homepage and click on the three horizontal lines to open the sidebar where you will find For Educators. The Educators section is full of lesson plans that can be used to teach neuroscience in a classroom, as well as content to help educators better understand the study of neuroscience. Along the top, you will see 5 subtopics of educator resources that may be of interest to teachers. The For the Classroom section includes tons of activities to be used during classroom instruction. These activities can be sorted by topic and grade level, so you can find exactly what works for your students. The Teaching Techniques section consists of articles for teachers to learn more about neuroscience and how it impacts their students during growth mindset, integrating art into STEM teaching, and the truth behind brain-based learning. Overall, there are over 300 lesson plans, articles, videos, and more. We also want to show you the Find a Neuroscientist program. This database is full of neuroscientists interested in public outreach and working with students and teachers. By filling out the questions, you will be given a list of local neuroscientists and their contact information. These neuroscientists have volunteered to host a lab tour, participate in a classroom visit, lead an activity, help with Brain Awareness Week, or answer neuroscience-related questions via email. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Dr. Donita Robinson is an associate professor of psychiatry in the Bowles Center for Alcohol Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She studies how addictive drugs such as alcohol and nicotine affect decision-making in the brain and whether drug use during adolescence can produce long-lasting effects on the brain. Dr. Robinson runs a research lab in the UNC Bowles Center for Alcohol Studies and participates in the Neurobiology of Adolescents Drinking in Adulthood Consortium. Dr. Nagel is a professor of psychiatry and behavioral neuroscience at Oregon Health and Science University. Her research focuses on adolescent brain and cognitive development in healthy and at-risk populations. Her lab has been conducting studies of Portland area youth with aims toward identifying neurobiological markers of risk and resilience for psychopathology, including addiction, in hopes of ultimately informing more targeted intervention and prevention efforts. Let's hear from Donita.
Well, thank you, Richard. I appreciate that introduction, and welcome to everybody who's on the webinar. On today, we have some goals, and our goals are to provide you information on how alcohol works in the brain. And this information should be useful for you as you work with adolescents, whether you're teachers or parents or healthcare providers or community members. I'm going to tell you about some of the unique qualities of the adolescent brain and how that leads to different specific adolescent-like behaviors, but also risks, and how alcohol impacts adolescents because of their brain development. And then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Bonnie Nagel, who will talk about how alcohol drinking impacts brain development itself and some of the risk markers that can predict alcohol use. So when we look at the brain, we can, of course, the brain's very complicated, lots of different systems, but some of the basic systems in the brain are those that are designed to find and get rewards. And these rewards are things that, of course, are important for survival. And so if we think about decision making, these brain circuits play a big role. But adolescent decision making, the GO system, are these systems that are involved in finding rewards that are heightened by emotions are really activated. They're triggered with puberty and hormones, and they come online really early during development. Now, it's not always good to go, and you need another system in the brain, the stop system, to kind of moderate our go behavior and to give us what we call executive control. And that part of the brain is the prefrontal cortex. And that part of the brain actually is online during adolescence, but it's not as mature, and it actually matures all the way into the mid-20s. And so when you think of adolescent decision making, the go system is going to be a lot stronger than the stop system, especially under emotionally charged circumstances. And so this brain development stage, from it arises a lot of those behaviors that we consider to be kind of adolescent typical behaviors. Things like disregarding negative consequences, knowing that there might be a negative consequence, but thinking, oh, it's not going to happen to me, or inflating positive consequences, being very sensitive to rewards and very motivated by rewards. We also see that adolescents show a lot of risk-taking behavior, novelty-seeking behavior, sensation-seeking, and you see an importance of social context and peers during this part of life. And what's really interesting is that you might be thinking that all of these characteristics are human. This is human adolescence. But in fact, we see the same things in all adolescent mammals. We see it in rats and mice that we often use in research. We see it in cats and dogs. These are adolescent typical behaviors that are really biologically driven and are really important and adaptive. For example, in most mammals, it's during adolescence that animals and individuals need to leave the nest, go out and be their own person. And that's a really scary thing. So you need to be brave. You need to disregard negative consequences. This is very adaptive for mammals. But this also can be a risk because there's an increased risk for drug experimentation during this developmental stage. And we see this if we look at reports of alcohol use or other drug use during the adolescent period. So what you see here are data from a national survey, Monitoring the Future survey, and these are data from 2018. And in the green bars, there are reports from 8th graders, and in the orange bars, you see reports from 12th graders. And so what you can see that even in 8th graders, 20% of 8th graders have tried alcohol. That's what you see under alcohol lifetime. And almost the same amount have used alcohol within the past month. Fewer have actually reported binge drinking in the last month. But you see that all of these accounts go up somewhat dramatically in 12th graders. You see similar numbers if we look at nicotine use, either through vaping or cigarette, if we look at marijuana use, and if we look at illicit drug use. So certainly adolescence is the time of life when many people try and sometimes continue to use addictive drugs. So what are these addictive drugs doing to the brain? Well, we already know that the GO system is really active and influential during adolescence. All of these addictive drugs, alcohol, stimulants, opiates, nicotine, they all have different targets in the brain because they're different kinds of drugs, and these are pharmacological agents. But one common mechanism of action or one common target in the brain is to activate the GO system. And most of them also inactivate or subdue the stop system. So not only do you have this different balance during development, that adolescents are more likely to go than to stop, then you have the drug effect amplifying that. In this slide, I just wanted to point out that these are just a couple of the places where alcohol affects the brain. Alcohol actually is what we would call a dirty drug in that it has a lot of different targets in our bodies and in the brain. And it really acts on so many areas of the brain. We've talked about judgment, that would be the stop system, and impulse control, the go system. But also there's just consciousness, there's memory, which I'll talk more about in a minute, and there's coordination, even breathing. And this is why you can get overdoses, lethal overdoses from alcohol use. But a lot of these effects are dose dependent, or depend on how much alcohol you actually drink. And a lot of these involve different systems of the brain. And guess what? They're different. Alcohol is working differently in the adolescent brain than in the adult brain. And I want to give you a couple of examples of this. So if you think of a high dose of alcohol, how do adolescents respond to a lot of alcohol? Well, adolescents tend to have parties. They're going to respond by being activated, by staying up, drinking more, having a good time. And here's the adult response to a high dose of alcohol. Adults tend to fall asleep. That's a sedative effect of alcohol. That's rate limiting. If you get sedated and you fall asleep, you actually stop drinking. So that adult response is protective. But because of their differences in brain development, adolescents are more sensitive to alcohol reward, which means when they start drinking, they want to keep drinking. They're less sensitive to the alcohol sedation, which means that instead of falling asleep, they're more likely to keep going. And then another difference that I'm very interested in is that adolescents are more sensitive to alcohol-induced memory impairments or memory disruptions. And I think this is really important because what's the job of an adolescent? Well, they're students. Their job is to learn and remember things, to going to school, and that is definitely impaired by alcohol more during adolescence than in other parts of lifespan. And I'm going to show you an example of this. Oh, and before I move on, let me just point out, this is biological because we see these same things, these same differential sensitivities in animals like rats and mice that we do in people. So I wanted to show you an example of how alcohol affects memory and how that can be different depending on the ages. But this is a human study, and it's done in participants who were either early 20s or late 20s. And your first thought might be, wait, that's not adolescence. And I would tell you two things. First is that it's illegal to give underage youth alcohol in the lab. So we can't do those studies. But also, brain development continues into the mid-20s. And so from a neuroscientist point of view, the 20 to 24-year-old group actually is still an adolescent, although you might call them a late adolescent. But in this study, this was a study done at Duke University. They brought these 20-year-olds into the lab and gave them all alcohol or a placebo that in the alcohol group brought their breath alcohol concentrations up to the legal driving limit. And then they did a memory test, which was indicated by the box. And the memory test was something like this, where they have this abstract image that doesn't have any intrinsic meaning, but they're told to remember as many parts of this picture as you can. And they're given a certain period of time to memorize the picture and then distracted with something like math problems, and then asked to recall how many of the parts of the picture do you remember. And in the older 20-year-olds, this amount of alcohol that brought them up to the legal driving limit, that didn't affect their memory. They remembered just about as many items in the alcohol group as they did under the placebo condition. But the early 20-year-olds had a big effect on their memory. So alcohol reduced the number of items that they remembered. And I think this is really profound because this is not a really, you wouldn't necessarily consider this a very large age range, but just the difference between early 20s and later 20s, and that alcohol can have such a different effect on memory systems. And again, it's biological because we can actually give rats and mice who are underage alcohol, and we see that this is actually an adolescent phenomenon, that adolescents are more sensitive to the memory impairments by alcohol. So if we go back to some of these differences in sensitivities, adolescents are more sensitive to rewards, so they're likely to drink more once they start drinking. They're less sensitive to the sedation, so they don't have that rate-limiting step. They don't have that natural way to stop drinking. And they're more sensitive to alcohol-induced memory disruption. Well, guess what? This is the perfect storm for both binge drinking and potentially for blackouts. So what's binge drinking? Well, the definition of binge drinking that you'll typically see by the National Institutes of Health is about 5 drinks for men in a session, and a session is thought to be about 2 hours, and 4 drinks for women. And really what's critical is that you have high levels of alcohol in the blood. Well, because of that, there's actually a fair amount of support that this definition should be much lower in adolescents, something around 3 drinks for girls and 3 to 5 drinks for boys, but depending on how old they are and how large they are, because several things can influence the blood alcohol levels after drinking, things like body weight, your sex, and also whether you're eating when you're drinking and how quickly you're drinking. But the risk of high blood alcohol levels is one of the risks, at least, is that it can lead to blackouts because it's these high levels that can cause really profound memory impairments. So what's a blackout? Well, of course, a blackout is when someone drinks so much that they have no memory of the drinking events. And this is a study where they looked at things that people did in a blackout. Of course, people didn't remember doing these things. They found out that they did these things, maybe from their friends or from reports, maybe from a police record. They found out that they insulted someone. About a third of the people did that. Many of them spent more money than they intended. About a quarter of the people found out that they engaged in sexual activity. And if you skip down a few items, you'll find that much of that sexual activity was either unprotected and or unwanted. You see a sex difference here if you look at vandalizing property, that a third of the guys vandalize property. You don't see the females doing as much of that. But what I think is really striking about these activities is these are things that normally you would remember. These are emotionally charged activities. These are things that normally are really well established in our memory systems, and yet people have no recollection of them. And I'd like you to consider what other things can cause this kind of memory loss. And it's things that like stroke, things like concussion, and really multiple concussions to cause this kind of memory loss. Things like traumatic brain injury or maybe Alzheimer's disease. And so I'd like you to really think about how we're classifying blackout. You see it in the media as something that's the funny plot of a movie, but really blackout should be considered a neurological trauma based on what it's doing to the brain and our memory systems. So I hope I've shown you how alcohol affects the brain and behavior in the moment and how that might be different in adolescents than in adults. But what does alcohol do to adolescent brain development? And for that, my colleague Bonnie Nagel will take it over. Bonnie?
Thank you, Donita, and thank you to everyone who's listening on the webinar. As Donita mentioned, I'm going to be talking about what alcohol is doing to the adolescent brain in terms of its development. We already talked a little bit about how it's a time of rapid development well into the 20s in life, and we're going to talk about exactly what alcohol is doing to those patterns of development over time, and then spend a moment talking a little bit about some of the risk markers that we know tend to predict higher levels of alcohol use during this time. So first, as Donita mentioned, the brain is rapidly developing during this time, and it develops well into the 20s. What's important, and as you see in this colorful slide here, is that there are regions of the brain that develop quite early. Those that are in the warm colors on the left at age 5 or 6 are the ones that are still really immature, and you can see some of the cool colored areas that are blue are the areas that are maturing first. And as you go through age along that left to right diagram, you can see that regions of the brain that remain somewhat cooler colored, regions of the prefrontal cortex, like Donita mentioned, that stop system in the brain, as well as regions of the go system, remain relatively immature. What's also really important is that the connections in the brain that allow that go system, that stop system to talk to the go system are also immature, and that's the white matter in the brain that really continues to mature and develop well into the third decade of life. Now, not only are the gray matter or the neurons that do the talking in the brain developing and the white matter that does the connecting in the brain developing, but there are parts of the brain that are responsive to behavior, and this is really that go system that Donita was talking about. So we can see over large studies looking at development across ages 10 to 25 that the part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens that is responsive to reward is most highly responsive during those adolescent years. So right around age 15, 16, 17, that's when we see the peak in the brain of reward responsivity. And what we also can see is that the amygdala, another part of that go system that is highly responsive to emotions, those positive emotions, negative emotions, that part of the brain responds much more to emotional stimuli during adolescence than it does during childhood or adulthood. And so the brain is developing, yet what we see is that adolescents tend to use more of this go system or emotion and reward areas of the brain rather than that stop system, the reasoning areas, to make decisions. Now, it's important to make a distinction that adolescents perform differently in what we call hot or cold situations. And so a hot situation may be where the go system is already driving with peers or when their emotions are riding high. And that's very different than when you're sitting at a dining room table or in a classroom one-on-one with a teen. Of course, they're able to say how to make good decisions. They're able to say what they would do in heated situations when they're not in them. But really, it's kind of a derailment of the stop system when those emotions and the reward system are driving the situation. So alcohol, as has already been alluded to, certainly affects the brain acutely, meaning under the influence of alcohol. But it also does things that seem to persist even after just when an individual is not intoxicated. And so there have been several studies looking at the prefrontal cortex, so that very part of the brain that's involved in that stop system, the part that's needed for intact problem solving, reasoning, and inhibition, that part seems to be impacted in individuals who are binge drinking. Similarly, the part of the brain, the hippocampus, that's involved in memory seems to be smaller in individuals who have engaged in heavy drinking compared to non-drinking control peers. So that's not surprising based on some of the memory deficits that have been shown. But here we're showing not just under the acute influence of alcohol, but also persisting effects where the part of the brain that's involved in some of these important decision-making and memory activities that teens are doing are impacted by the kind of use that they're engaging in. Now, this is a study that actually is a longitudinal study following individuals who were non-drinking and following them over time for 3 years. And what we can see here is that in regions of the brain where we're expecting to see some declining volumes, remember that slide that I showed you that showed the areas of the brain that were developing across time, we expect there to be some decline in cortical development. It's part of the normal maturation. And here, what we can see is that in green, we have people who are not drinking. And the slope of change that we see there is different in those that are moderate drinkers in orange and heavy drinkers in gray, such that their gray matter is declining faster at a faster rate than we would want it to in normal development. Similarly, in the white matter, which remember I told you is supposed to be getting larger, those are the connections of the brain, what we can see in non-drinkers in the green is that theirs is the percent of change their slope of change in decline is actually smaller than those in gray. Now, as Donita mentioned, we often think a lot of this is due to sort of a dose response, meaning the more you drink, associated with some of that blackout and those high levels of blood alcohol concentration, the worse some of these findings are. And so here, what you can see on these graphs is that the slope of change is impacted by the maximum number of drinks or drinks per occasion that an individual has engaged in, such that we have greater decline in some of those brain regions, greater decline in gray matter or the parts of the brain that do the communicating as a function of how many drinks they've had. This is another study that points out some of that dose response, and this is looking at the white matter connections in the brain. And remember, the white matter is the part of the brain that allows an individual's stop system to talk to that go system. It's the part that says, hey, wait a minute, maybe I don't want to make this decision. Maybe I don't want to engage in this behavior. So the connections that allow that communication to occur are really important. And what we can see here is that this region that's pointed to that's in a slightly warmer color is much more intact in individuals who are non-drinking and then continues to get less intact or there's less integrity there as the slope goes down as a function of a peak blood alcohol content in the last 3 months. So that's an estimate of binge drinkers. The more that you drink, the less integrity you have in this connection that's so important. So I talked a little bit about what's happening in the brain, but let's talk about what's happening with regard to behavior under the influence of drinking. Now, this is a study that was published a few years back showing what happens to impulsive behavior as we age. And what you can see here is that our 10, 11, 12, 13-year-olds tend to be, on average, a bit more impulsive than some of the later ages, and it tends to kind of linearly decline across adolescence. However, in my lab, we did a study where we looked at what happens in people who don't drink versus those who do drink. And this is, again, a longitudinal study that starts by following individuals who are non-drinkers, and then some individuals go on to drink during adolescence and some do not. And what you can see is the line in blue very much looks like the graph I just showed you on the left, where if you start out as an adolescent who doesn't drink and you continue to not drink, you show a decline in your impulsive behavior. However, if you're a binge drinker, you start out at the same level of impulsivity at 14, but you never decline. And so that's important because we want to see, as people mature and get older, the ability to control impulses better. And what we're seeing here is that alcohol may impact that stop system in a negative way. Now, another study, and something that we do in my lab, is look to see how the brain responds during different types of tasks. And that's done using functional magnetic resonance imaging, where we can do a task in the scanner, and while we do that, we see what the brain is doing. And this is a task where people are making decisions, both risky decisions and safe decisions. And it's another longitudinal study where on the left, when we see baseline, none of those individuals have been drinking at all. So all are alcohol naive, and you can see that when they make a risky response in the brain, this happens to be in that stop system of the brain, they show people who are ultimately going to go on to binge drink and those who are not going to show the same level of response. However, on the right, when it says revisit, what has happened there is that those in blue stayed non-drinkers while those in red went on to binge drink. And you can see that the brain area, the prefrontal cortex that does that stop system control, shows a real decline such that it's not even responding during risky choices anymore. And then, much like I've shown you before, this tends to relate to how much they've been drinking in the past 3 months, so that the more that they drank, the less of a response that they have in this region of the brain under risky decisions. And this is just another graph showing that same thing. So one of the things that is really important to figure out is I've shown you that based on these longitudinal studies where we're able to look at individuals before they've ever had a drop of alcohol and follow them over time, we can see that there is something altered in the way that their brain develops if they go on to binge drink. But we certainly know that not all brains are created equal and that there might be some behavioral or brain features that actually predict who is going to go on to engage in heavy drinking. This is really important because this gives us targets for potential intervention before individuals go on to use. So if I had all the time in the world, I'd be able to go into each of these areas to tell you a little bit about how they predict alcohol and substance use disorders. But suffice to say, we know that there are genetic features that elevate risk for individuals using alcohol. We know that earlier onset of use is really important in predicting alcohol use later on, individual differences in brain development, and there are a number of environmental features that are really important in that certainly teachers and educators have a lot of interplay with, and those are things such as peer deviance, so individuals who associate with other individuals that are using alcohol or engaging in deviant behavior tend to have higher risk for engaging in substance use. Higher levels of parental monitoring are really important in preventing substance use, things like that. And then, as I mentioned before, things that we've studied, impulsivity, as well as risk-taking and sensation-seeking, varying levels of those features are also associated with elevated risk for alcohol and substance use disorders later on. So as you could imagine, higher levels of impulsivity, sensation-seeking, and risk-taking are associated with higher levels of alcohol and substance use during adolescence. So just to show one of the studies that we have conducted in my lab, and again, all of the studies that we are talking about here are studies that allow us to look at some of those chicken or the egg questions. So if a group of individuals are alcohol naive at time 1, and then we follow them over time, we can say, what is different about those that went on to drink versus those that do not? And that's sort of how we've informed some of these risk features that I just spoke about. This particular study is, again, looking at how the brain responds while individuals are engaged in a task in the scanner. And we can look to see how their brain responds when they make risky choices. So how rewarding is it? And this is, again, this area of the brain is called the ventral striatum, or the nucleus accumbens. This is the part of the brain that responds when an individual receives reward. And we're able to look at how individuals are responding when they're receiving rewards in the scanner. And these are monetary rewards. And then we can look to see how that response in the brain ultimately relates to behavior going forward. And what we can see is that the more reward response an individual receives in their brain when they're receiving a reward, that is associated with how quickly they're going to go on to drink, such that the more rewarding this sort of risky behavior is, the more likely they're going to engage in binge drinking sooner. And so those findings are very similar to some of the findings that I just mentioned a moment ago, pointing out that sensation-seeking or risk-taking, some of those things are present early on in the brain that lead an individual to drink. And then going back to the slides I showed you before, really can change the way that those systems develop in the brain going forward. So just to kind of wrap up some of the things that we have been talking about here, what's really, really important is that the adolescent brain is still developing well into the mid-20s. And as Donita mentioned, and as I reiterated, what we can see here is this GO system that is the part of the brain that responds to reward and to emotion that is highly active during adolescence. This is the part of the brain that drives some of the decision-making that we see and some of the challenges that we see in adolescent behavior. Now, it is also important to remember that the stop system is also developing. So that's those prefrontal regions of the brain, really, really important in regulating our behavior, helping individuals to make good decisions, helping for that impulse control. And what Donita showed and what I also showed is that both acutely And long term, alcohol and drugs seem to change the way these systems are developing, such that the go system remains a little more active than the stop system throughout adolescence. Now, adolescents and young adults, especially even into their early 20s and more so when they're younger, they experience alcohol's effects differently. And again, this is going back to what Donita described. But what we can see is that in the moment under the influence of alcohol, these younger folks tend to have more sensitivity to the rewarding effects, more memory disruption, and less sensitivity to alcohol's sedating effects. And as was mentioned before, those sedating effects are helpful in stopping us from continuing to drink, which is not something that adolescents tend to experience. Binge drinking patterns, which we talked about, are going up pretty substantially during adolescent years, rising quite highly from 8th to 12th grade. And that type of binge drinking that I showed is related to different changes in the brain, are especially harmful, and including that blackout that Donita was talking about, where all sorts of harmful decisions and actions are made. We do know that these adolescent drinkers are showing altered brain function and structure and behavior. Again, sort of talking about the types of patterns of behavior that adolescents engage in with drinking. That tends to be those binge patterns, that high level of drinking. And so when we think about these effects being dose dependent, it really does mean that how much they drink matters. So the more they drink, the worse those outcomes are going to be. And it's very important to disentangle some of these pre-existing risk features in the brain. As I showed you, the brain is different before an individual even goes on to drink from the consequences of alcohol themselves. Many of the brain regions, as I mentioned before, that are impacted by alcohol are those that are so very important in these stop-and-go systems. And so when we're disrupting the normal development of these systems, it really renders an individual at more risk for not only continued drug and alcohol use, but also other poor outcomes. And lastly, it's really going to be important for us to understand the brain features associated with risk for alcoholism and kind of, again, disentangling those from the known consequences of alcohol in the brain so that we can then have brain-informed prevention and intervention strategies. So if we know individuals with certain risk features are at risk, we can really target things that can even be done in the school-based systems to try to prevent those individuals from going on to develop significant problems with alcohol and drug use. So here is a list of the resources we have for all of you to take a look at. I want to thank you so much for your time participating in this webinar, and we will now open it to questions.
So thank you, Elizabeth, for your compliment. For both scientists, what would you say are the biggest or most important questions that should be answered about the effects of alcohol use on the brain?
Oh, wow, that's a loaded question. There's so much that we don't know. But as you know, as a scientist, but also as a parent, what I'm really concerned about are those are really the persistent effects of alcohol. And that's one reason why I do this research, because it's really kids are gonna when adolescents drink, they tend to binge drink. What are the consequences of that? Are they short term? Are they going to just age out of it? Many people do. But when will there be long term consequences? Under what circumstances? And also, when might what makes the difference between the people who can what we call age out of it? They get jobs, responsibilities. They're able to stop drinking, and those who can't. And so we really don't have a good handle on that, and that will be very important for being able to help people who are having issues, who are having trouble to moderate their drinking. Also, the persistent effects, that's one reason why I use animals in my research is because with animal studies we can give the alcohol during the adolescent period and really see what are the effects of just this alcohol exposure. And then we can give things like, really targeted treatments that might reverse or prevent some of these effects of alcohol, things that we can't necessarily do in people yet. So there's so much left to learn about this. there's a lot of research to do.
And I would just echo what you're saying, Donita. I really think that it is really understanding sort of who is at the most risk, what kinds of interventions are going to work for them, for whom is drinking during adolescence really going to result in significant problems later in life. And I think we just have, from a human angle, we have so many individual differences. We're all really unique as humans, and I think it takes very, very, very large studies to understand sort of that individual difference and heterogeneity. So,
Thank you both. Joseph asked, is it accurate to say that the heavy use of alcohol and drugs can effectively extend the period of adolescent disconnect between the stop-and-go centers of the brain?
I think that some of the slides that I showed on that, just showing how alcohol can actually impact those systems of the brain, and the way that it's doing that is really by enhancing some of that go system that we think of as part of that immaturity, and really suppressing some of that stop system, which is actively developing during this time, but really needs to fully develop in order to regulate behavior in the most optimal way. So if we think about it that way, and we think about enhancing what's part of the adolescent period, and then preventing some of the development that we think of necessary in the adolescent period, I suppose we could make the conclusion that it is sort of making a longer adolescent time of life. And we can't say that definitively, but that is what it sort of looks like.
Next question. What kinds of animal studies are needed to enhance our knowledge?
Yeah, I'll take that. This is Donita. Animal studies are really useful for when we can't do things in people, and so certainly some of the research that's looking to correct, whether it's to reverse or prevent some of the effects of binge alcohol on the adolescent brain, are necessary to do in animals. We're finding that maybe a long-term treatment with anti-inflammatories or drugs that boost specific kinds of neurotransmission, like acetylcholine transmission in the brain, those things do seem to be able to reverse some of the effects of binge adolescent alcohol exposure in animals. But you wouldn't necessarily want to try those in people because we don't know enough about the consequences of those drugs. But what's really interesting to me, and might answer some of the other questions that I've seen popping up from the audience, is that a really exciting finding from the animal research is that intense exercise can also reverse or prevent some of the effects of binge alcohol, and probably through things like increasing beneficial chemicals in the brain like growth factors. So animal studies are great for that. And then also, like Bonnie mentioned, they're really important for kind of teasing apart cause and effect, because when people, there are things that can promote alcohol drinking that look very similar to the consequences of alcohol drinking, and how do you separate those apart? But with animal studies, we can control for those things, control for genetics, control for environment, and answer some of those questions.
Thank you. Sharon asked, are there ways to develop that stop inhibiting portion of the brain before adolescence?
I think that's an excellent question as well. Certainly as parents and educators and people who interact with adolescents, we would love to be able to do that. And I think that it is indeed the case that even in early childhood, it's not to say that kids don't have prefrontal abilities or executive control stop system abilities. Even children as young as 2-3 years of age can learn how to stop themselves from doing more kind of impulsive or types of behavior that really are indicative of being able to stop. So we can enhance that, and I think it's an interesting sort of societal question, because I often talk to parents and educators, and I think about it in terms of exercising the brain, right? We need to be put into sort of safer situations where we can exercise that inhibitory stop system in the brain and get those connections that really rein in that go system to continue to develop. And the brain functions in a way where experience does make a very big difference. And so when we're asking kids and putting them in, situations where they're needing to stop themselves, but still are safe enough situations where if an error happens, because we know they do, they're not going to be at terrible risk. So I would say developing that system it comes by way of practice.
Thank you. Next question. What is the relationship between binge drinking and addiction?
I
can say
that.
Yeah, I can say that certainly, that's a hard question to answer definitively, right? Because it takes a lot of longitudinal kind of studies over time that look at kids that binge drink during adolescence and then really follow them throughout the course of a good chunk of their lives to see sort of who goes on to develop addiction or meets diagnostic criteria for addiction. And so while those studies are starting to be done, I will say that we do know that earlier onset of alcohol use and heavier use does seem to be associated with a greater likelihood of developing more diagnostic use disorders later on in life. And I don't know, Donita, the animal research tells us a little bit about sort of what happens with that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would just add that, no, I wouldn't add anything. I think that's great.
Okay. I guess as a follow-up, can the effects of early alcohol use be mediated?
So I'm not sure that I understand exactly what kind of mediation the individual is asking about, but certainly if we think about, when I think about mediation, I think about changing the relationship. And so if the question is, are there things that we can do that can fix some of the effects of alcohol use, I think emerging research is suggesting that when an individual drinks heavily during development, if they stop drinking, we can see some recovery of both brain and behavioral functioning. And so there's again, that requires following people over time to really see what happens. And so our definitive knowledge on that is a little limited, but I would say that certainly stopping is one thing. And then I think, addressing another question that I saw come up on the screen, also there are certainly more protective things that individuals can engage in that are good for the brain. Things like maintaining good sleep, maintaining good diet, exercising. Those are all things shown to be very, very good for the brain. And so to the extent that someone stops using alcohol and engages in healthy adaptive behaviors, certainly that would potentially change the relationship between heavy alcohol use and later outcomes.
I would just like to emphasize that the animal research supports that, and also how critical sleep is. That I think we underestimate the importance of sleep on our resiliency as in a lot of biological ways, but particularly in the brain. And sleep is particularly important for teenagers and emerging adults. And that can, getting alcohol actually disrupts sleep. So drinking can disrupt sleep just pharmacologically, but then not having a lot of sleep can make someone vulnerable to more alcohol use. So it can be a kind of bad cycle.
Thank you. Juliet asked, is there a thing, or is there such a thing as safe and supervised teen drinking?
So I think there's a couple ways to think about that. I would say no, as a definitive answer, just with regard to the safety and even with regard to supervision. And I know this is kind of a hot topic out there, that the idea that if we tell teens not to drink, they're going to want to do it more. But there is a literature suggesting that a lot of times what I'll be asked is, well, if I don't prevent my teen from drinking and I let them have alcohol in the home, won't that make it a little bit less exotic and make it a little less appealing to them, so it won't be so forbidden? And the research actually does not suggest that. The research suggests that even early sipping at home is associated just as much with drinking, and if, in fact, maybe even more with heavy drinking later on. Again, there's a ton of individual differences in how humans behave, how their brains work, how all the relationships that we've been talking about today. But I would say, in general, the research does not support that there is a safe, supervised teen drinking. It is more that it suggests that it potentially places people at risk for heavier drinking later on. So I don't know if Donita, you have anything to add on that.
Just to reinforce what you've said, there's a study that I read a few years ago, I think it was from 2016, that was really impactful for me, mainly as a parent. I have a teenage daughter. And the study looked at, it was a survey that they looked at children who had sipped alcohol in the context of the home with their parents in 6th grade, and those children were more likely to have consumed a full drink of alcohol in the 9th grade. So I agree. Even the parents being involved doesn't mean that it's going to be protective.
Thank you. I have two questions here that I think can be combined. One part of it is, what is the influence of moderate drinking in teenagers? And other than abstaining from drinking, is there anything that can be neuroprotective against the effects of teenage binge drinking, i.e. diet, exercise, etc.?
So I think we talked a little bit about some of those, kind of both angles of that a moment ago. One is that, as I showed in several of the slides, we do tend to see a dose-related appearing effect on both the brain and even behavior, so that the more an individual drinks, the worse the outcomes appear to be, which would suggest that moderate drinking, as somewhere kind of in the mid-range there, does have an effect on the brain and behavior, maybe not as severe of an effect as heavy drinking, but certainly an effect is seen. In terms of things that are protective, I know it takes studies kind of looking at all of these variables, which are still kind of emerging in the field. However, we do know that there's lots of things that people can do that are healthy for the brain. As I mentioned earlier, diet, sleep, exercise, all those things, extracurricular activities that are healthy, all sort of work the brain in a positive way and develop it in a positive way. So certainly those things are all potentially going to help develop a healthier brain.
One participant asked, I'm curious about age and sex differences. For instance, how different are the long-term effects in a less than 15-year-old versus a greater than 15-year-old, and then women versus men?
That's also a good question. The research has been pretty consistent to say that the earlier an individual drinks, the higher likelihood they have to go on to develop a use disorder or a diagnostic criteria for addiction later on. And so while the brain research has not quite figured out why that is, although we have tried, it is indeed the case that younger drinking appears to be more risky for longer-term bad outcomes. In terms of differences in males and females, we know that there are differences, but they're not as cut and dry as we would hope to be able to explain. So certainly, even when they drink the same amount, there are definitely differences in how it impacts the brain, and I think emerging research is still kind of trying to figure out exactly what those differences look like.
Mm-hmm. And that's where animal research may be useful, because we can look at some of these biological differences between males and females, and we won't know for certain whether what we see in rodent models, for example, will map onto people. But we have found that there are definitely sex differences in animal models to alcohol exposure during adolescence. For example, some studies show that females may be more sensitive to some of the cognitive effects of alcohol, while males may be more sensitive to some of the effects to promote anxiety and anxious social behavior. So those are great. That's a really active area of research, and it's a great question because it's an important one for us to figure out.
Thank you. Next question is, how important are life or stress life issues to the sensitivity to alcohol's effect?
So I think this could be an entire webinar of its own. However, we do know that stress and traumatic life events and high levels of stress have their own unique impact on the brain. And so the systems that are impacted by those things tend to be similar systems to those impacted by alcohol. So to some extent, we would expect the impact to be worse, kind of a cumulative effect of kind of two things happening in the brain that really are not necessarily good on the brain side of things. So I think the research would suggest that people who have been exposed to high levels of stress and trauma are at greater risk for some of the addictive behaviors and higher levels of use that we have been talking about today.
Thank you both so much, and thank you for our participants. This will be our last question. And for both sciences, what would you say are the biggest or most important questions that still need to be answered about the effects of alcohol use on the brain?
I think we talked about that one a little bit already, but really just understanding some of those individual differences, kind of who is at greatest risk for going on and having poor outcomes, and how do we change the course for those individuals? How do we prevent? How do we treat? How do we intervene in a way that makes a difference at the end of the day?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and from the animal research point of view, how do we restore brain health and balance to the different circuits of the brain that might have been disrupted by adolescent alcohol?
Okay, that was our final question. Thank you so much for attending this webinar, and we hope that you have an amazing